So I was trying to give an update or a wrap up on the work that we'd been doing so far, and the focus of our project was really trying to understand the linkages between changes in plant community, how that was then linked to how that might then affect invertebrates, termites, ants, and soil processes. We also did some work with remote sensing and modeling, so I tried to give a sense of the progress with our research so far in terms of trying to stitch together all these connections and trying to understand how logging influenced the functionality of the system, primarily impacting the plant community first, and how that might then cascade through to influence different components of the ecosystem. Well, I think one of the interesting challenges of the project was trying to disentangle the effects that might arise from things like logging itself compared to sort of indirect changes in ecosystem function that might be linked to changes in biodiversity. So we were trying to sort of parse out or figure out what components of the system function were linked to these different types of effects. And I think one of the interesting things that we were able to establish was that some of the key components of ecosystem functionality, such as the ability to take up carbon dioxide from the atmosphere, climate change mitigation, that we were able to establish that even though logged forests had been, in many cases are quite badly damaged during the logging process, they're able to recover quite quickly. One of the important findings linked to that is the fact that even though there is rapid recovery, we see changes in the amount of carbon sequestration, that is how much carbon dioxide sort of taken out of the atmosphere, because logging itself has really changed some of the ways that carbon cycles within that ecosystem. So what we're finding is basically less of the carbon was being retained or held into the system, more of it was being released, and as a consequence the net effect meant that compared to an old growth environment, a lot less of that carbon was being stored. We also found the evidence that some of the major components of the system, such as the invertebrates and so forth, exerted a really strong control on how the system functioned. For instance, termites, which are often neglected, or they're just not as charismatic and exciting as big mammals and so forth. But one of the interesting findings was that termite activity was able to ameliorate the effects of disturbances like drought. So we sampled through a period of intense drought, the last sort of El Nino event, and we found that our study sites that had higher abundances of termites really maintained their functionality at a sort of more even rate compared to the ones that where termite levels were a lot lower in the system. So some evidence that some of these sort of ecosystem engineers, I suppose you could call them, help to buffer against change and disturbance and things like this. Well, I think the challenge is actually figuring out how to take that information and then, in this context, improve logging practices. So for instance, if we're thinking we want to accelerate recovery, what components of the system, what plant species, for sake of a better word, or what kinds of animals and so forth, including things like termites, what do we want to try and encourage, and what do we want to try, because there's certain measures that you can take in order to sort of improve how you sustainably manage, or in a more sort of environmentally friendly way manage these environments. And it's really important to kind of understand how the different components of the system respond, so that you can then decide in a management context how to tweak the system so that you basically get the most benefit, and that you can reduce sort of long-term impacts from things like logging. Well, I think we've finished the empirical data collection. So what we're trying to do is go through a lot of the data analysis, and one large component of our work is to try and do some upscaling, modeling. And what that means is basically taking these findings that we've collected at a sort of a smaller spatial level and try and extrapolate to, say, across the landscape, at this larger spatial scale of tens of kilometers or even thousands of kilometers, what our findings may then lead us to conclude is happening at these larger spatial scales. So that's something we're working on at the moment, to try and do some of that larger scale extrapolation. What we're also trying to do is use some of the data that we've collected to try and make inferences about how the systems are changing over time, over relatively short timescales, because that has implications for understanding long-term recovery trajectories, for example, or if we're thinking about climate change, for instance, greenhouse gases and so forth, things like this. The release of greenhouse gases or their uptake by ecosystems is happening at, can happen at relatively short timescales. So knowing, within a calendar year, for example, how the system is responding to, changes in weather, rainfall, temperature, and so forth, will help us better understand, year on year, how that system is interacting with the climate system and the atmosphere and things like this. One of the challenges in tropical ecology is trying to get to grips with the system's complexity and the fact that we have so many different components to the system. We're not just talking about vegetation, the plants, but we're talking about, the mammals, the birds, the insects, the soils, and so forth. And I think one of the benefits of working at SAFE is that you have different groups of researchers that are working towards a common goal in the broadest sense, understanding how, say something like logging or land conversion is influencing the system. But we have a large community of people that are working on all these different aspects of the system. And I think it's unique in that sense because there aren't very many research sites around the world where we have such a high density of experts that are trying to get to grips with the whole, suite, of different types of organisms. Usually we have study sites where people just focus on the plant community, or they're only looking at the large mammals, or whatever it is. But a very small number of systems where, there's a diverse sort of multidisciplinary team of people that are covering the whole, the whole spectrum, the whole system. So I think that makes it a sort of very powerful and unique study in that sense. It's studying these changes that are simulations, I suppose, in some sense, of what's happening in the real world, because there's some controlled element to what's happening. But there's this density of measurements that cover a whole suite of different organisms, processes, and so forth.